Thank you. At most conferences, the session which is least attended is straight after lunch. Samuel Griffith sensibly doesn't serve alcohol at lunch, but I gather that they served a lot of alcohol last night. So congratulations on your virtues in arriving today. The subject is 30 years of the Republic debate, and I've added a solution in search of a problem, which comes from a new book by young Sean Jacobs, who's Australian and Papua New Guinean origin. It's an excellent book from Connor Court called Thoroughly Modern Patriot. I propose to address this with three topics: from the foundation of the Republican movement to the referendum, secondly, from the referendum to today, and third, a subject mélange of myths, mendacities, and misrepresentations, all, of course, by Republicans. When I use a word, it means just what I want it to mean, nothing more or less. A republic is a Humpty Dumpty word like that, just like multiracial. And if you go to the Macquarie Dictionary, the first edition of the Macquarie Dictionary at the time of the beginning of the campaign, you'll see that the existing system fits into the first two definitions, and there's a good argument that it could fit into the third. In fact, Michael Kirby, who was one of the founders of ACM, wrote the charter of ACM, he says, during a dull moment in the Court of Appeal while he was presiding. I gather there's no shortage of dull moments in the Court of Appeal. He wrote, "Some of us believe Australia's already a republic, a crowned republic." Well, the present campaign, which has been going on for 30 years, is the third of three significant movements to establish a republic. All have been for other purposes, nothing to do with trying to find an ideal form of Republican government. The first in the 19th century was to establish a white apartheid republic with the principal purpose of getting away from British liberal immigration practice and to stop Asian immigration into Australia. And that was headed very much by the Bulletin. And I remember as a little boy still seeing the Bulletin. It came out, it was all pink. It came out with a banner underneath the Bulletin, "Australia for the white man." And that stayed on it until Kerry Packer bought it in the 60s and realized it was a bit out of date. The second Republican movement was to establish a Soviet or People's Republic. Eric Ahrens, the lovely old uncle of the Ahrens family, the Ahrens family seemed to run the Australian Communist Party as an hereditary fiefdom. And Eric Ahrens, in his book, admits that if they'd got into power, they would have had to execute quite a few people who were enemies of the Communist Republic. The third one dates from 1991, when attaining a republic, notwithstanding the fact that the great Labour leaders had been mainly constitutional monarchists. In 1991, Labour's national platform was changed to include getting an Australian republic. That was a revenge for the dismissal of the Whitlam government. The ARM itself was not born in heroic circumstances, like the Declaration of Independence or the Rights of Man. Thomas Keneally writes about it in his book. I quoted in this little book I wrote at the time of the referendum, The Cane-Toed Republic. And Thomas Keneally writes that it all began at Neville Rand's house in Woollahra in Sydney. And he says, "In a manner all too typical of generous Sunday lunches in Sydney, a number of bottles of Hunter River Chardonnay were emptied. Neville Rand leaned over the table and said, 'The other thing I want to see happen before I bloody well die is an Australian Republic.'" And so there you see the birth of Australian republicanism, a boozy lunch in an elite suburb in Sydney. The Republican movement really owed a lot to the impetus which two men of utterly insatiable political ambition did. One needed a distraction, and that was Paul Keating. And we know that from the recent release of correspondence between the Governor-General and the Queen, in which Bill Hayden, an associate of Keating, told the Queen that the issue of republicanism was a very handy one for Keating. If it really took off, it would be a gift from heaven, because distractions like taxes and unemployment and the state of the economy would tend to disappear. And the second personality who gave the Republican movement impetus was another man ambitious for getting into politics. He'd been trying for some years and then dominating politics, Malcolm Turnbull. They teamed up together, and Keating appointed Turnbull as the chairman of the Republic Advisory Committee. Now, you'd think that if you established a Republic Advisory Committee, it would have been to find out whether it was a good idea, why we should become a republic. No. The whole purpose of the Republic Advisory Committee was to find out how to become a republic. The first Keating-Turnbull republic was the result. It provided, differently from the referendum model, it provided that the president would be appointed by a two-thirds vote in both houses. They made the mistake of also stating that he could be dismissed by a two-thirds vote, not thinking of the obvious fact that if the president did something which irritated the government, the opposition would never join in giving the numbers for a two-third vote to remove the president. What they were doing, and I remember writing about this, what they were doing was effectively bringing into Australia, without realizing what they were doing, the French Fifth Republic. And if you think why the French have a Fifth Republic, remember it was after they had an absolute monarchy, two constitutional monarchies, fascism, a reign of terror, two empires, a US-style republic, and three parliamentary republics. So obviously they thought they'd better do something else and invented the Fifth Republic. With those two driven politicians, two themes emerged. One theme is completely unprovable. That is, that a republic is inevitable. Easy to believe in. You don't have to argue anything. You just say the republic is inevitable. The second thing was identified by Sir Henry Parkes at the time of Federation. And he said that the last thing we should do when we're designing our constitutional system is to satisfy, quote, the wild ravings, quote, of someone who may call out republicanism without the slightest knowledge of what he is talking about. So that's what you got, a republicanism which was driven by the view that it's inevitable, and you needn't have any idea of what a republic is about. And that, of course, that idea made it understandable that it should be so fashionable in electorates such as Wentworth, an electorate in which I live. There was also a further factor, and that was the media. Paul Kelly exposes in a lecture what the media is all about. You would have thought the media is about finding the facts of the day, the important facts of the day, and relaying them to the population as quickly as possible. Paul Kelly says the media has a vested interest in change. Change equates to news, and news is the lifeblood of the media. So the media is there to promote change. It's not there to tell you what's happening. Lord Deeds, who was the editor of the Daily Telegraph, previously been a minister in the wartime government, he wrote at the time of the referendum, "I've rarely attended elections in any democratic country in which the media has displayed more shameless bias. One and all, they were determined Australia should become a republic, and they used every device towards that end." So, with the media on side, two very strong personalities pushing it, many Liberal politicians, notwithstanding their platform, jumped onto the Republican bandwagon, so much so that it destabilised the Liberal Party. With a view to neutralise that, Alexander Downer and then his successor, John Howard, decided that the way to get the Republic out of the news, at least as a disadvantage to the Liberal Party, was to propose a convention. The question would be determined by a convention which would be at least partially elected. Meanwhile, in 1992, Australia's constitutional monarchy was formed, with Lloyd Waddy as the first national convener. In 1993, Hawke lamented that the monarchists are winning the intellectual argument. Then in 1996, after Bob Carr's premature takeover of Government House, allegedly returning it to the people, there was an enormous demonstration called by ACM. It was the largest peaceful demonstration in Macquarie Street, which indicated that there was a strong feeling out there in the community against a republic. The Republicans had never been able to hold any demonstration whatsoever with more people attending than the Republican officials there. This was a really enormous success, and Keating blames it, or blames Carr's premature action, for the loss of the next election. The convention was held. They realized that that first Keating-Turnbull republic had a serious error in it, so they produced a second version. It was, as we said at the time, the only republic in the world, indeed the only republic in history, in which it would be easier for the Prime Minister to sack the President than his driver. Now that meant that the President would be the puppet of the Prime Minister. He would know he could be sacked immediately. And that's the one they took to the referendum. The management of the process of running the referendum, running the convention, by the Howard government with Nick Minchin as the Special Minister of State was impeccable and absolutely fair. There were some myths developed later criticizing them. They ran it in such a way that nobody could complain that it wasn't fair, and I'll come to that a little later. There were a number of personalities on the side of the no vote. There was, for example, Lloyd Waddy. Tony Abbott became the first executive secretary, executive director of ACM, and entered into the national limelight and then took a seat in Parliament. Kerry Jones, David Elliott. David Elliott's role is sometimes forgotten. He's now a minister in the New South Wales state government. He was the national director of ACM. His job was to go around the country and to ensure that the people who wanted to help were being noted and that we could, in a way, invite them to help us. That developed into having across the country almost 60,000 foot soldiers. The Republicans had nothing like this. For the referendum itself, they had to ask the Labour Party and the trade unions to man the polling booths because they didn't have anybody themselves. Those people were very important, as was Michael Kirby. Michael Kirby, there's a wonderful story about Michael Kirby. When Gareth Evans proposed Michael Kirby for appointment to the High Court, he was then the President of the Court of Appeal, Keating, and maybe anecdotal, Keating is alleged to have said, we can't appoint him as a monarchist. And they thought about it for a while, and Evans came back with the line that, well, he's the only sensible person among the monarchists, the rest are a lot of deranged drongos or something like that. If you take him out, you'll neutralise the monarchists because he's the only one worthwhile. So Michael Kirby was appointed. And as you know, the result was, notwithstanding the media, notwithstanding the politicians and the great wealth of the Republican movement, it was won nationally, 45 to 55. It was won in all states and 72% of federal electorates, which gives you an idea of the concentration of the yes vote. Interestingly, in those electorates, many of those electorates that the Teal independents are contesting, those are electorates which are very ripe for new views and swing away from the traditional Liberal line, although they often were safe electorates. Well, that's the position in history, as it were, to the referendum. After the referendum, the Republicans didn't accept their defeat, and they've kept on fighting for another almost 20 years. There have been 12 major votes, inquiries, and draft legislation all at taxpayers' cost, except one, and they just won't give up. From 1999 to 2021, last year, the line was they adopted a policy which came from the European Union, which was that the people have to keep on voting until they get it right. And what they had was two plebiscites. First question, do you want a republic? They slipped in with an Australian head of state. Then the sort of republic, and finally the referendum. And that went on, and obviously it wasn't working out, so they finally revealed their new model in 22. In the meantime, Julian Hill released his idea of the way in which Australia could become a republic by circumventing the referendum. This was an extraordinary proposal. I doubt if he would put it out if the hierarchy hadn't decided it should be tested. And what his proposal was to use the law relating this to the succession, change the succession so that the Queen would be followed not by the heir to the throne, the Queen would be followed by some process which would make Kevin, you'd have a King Kevin, a King Malcolm, or a King Bob Brown. Somebody that they wanted could then become the President of Australia. There'd be some process which would be the successor to the Queen. In 2022, they released a model which they promised to be released sometime in 2021. And as you know, it's the revenge for Whitlam's dismissal, because it strips the president of any reserve powers. The president will be a puppet. There'll be 11 candidates, a real politicians' republic. 11 candidates, all chosen by the politicians of different parliaments, including the parliaments of two territories, including the local council in Canberra, which is called a parliament. Those 11 candidates will be then put to the people, and the people will apparently decide this. It didn't do what it was proposed to do, that is, unite those Republicans who want to have a popular election with those Republicans who want it to be an appointment by Parliament. Didn't in any way unite them. And most prominent Republicans gave it a very lukewarm reception, or they were opposed to it, the exception being Jason Falinski, who heads the parliamentary group for a republic. I think they call it Australian head of state. He's the Liberal MP on the North Shore. The Republicans, however, are desperate. They have a gnawing fear that the second referendum is doomed. And they're right there. There are two reasons why the referendum is doomed. Firstly, when Australians say no, they always mean no. There are 9 cases of repeat questions being put to the people in referendums. Some of them have been put more than once, some up to 5 times. And every time when the people are asked again, they always say no. The other factor which leads me to the conclusion that a second referendum is doomed is glancing at the opinion polls, not one opinion poll, but the opinion polls over time and the real opinion polls. There's one opinion poll, which is a fake opinion poll, run by one prominent organisation, which after it had been commissioned by the ARM, decided to change their question. It used to be, are you in favour of Australia becoming a republic? It's now, are you in favour of Australia becoming a republic with an Australian head of state, which is a point in issue between the parties? That is worth 8 points. If you look at go through the polling, you'll see that gives you 8 more points. So naturally, the Republicans want head of state in the issue. The best poll, the best recent poll, was by Ipsos. And it revealed that support for a vague republic, not before the model comes out, because when the model comes out, Republicans divide and the number go to the no side, as we saw in the referendum. There are only 34% who are in favour of a vague republic. When you read the polls, you ignore the undecided, and of course the monarchists, you just look at the support for a republic. The undecided normally will come across to the no vote. So don't worry about the undecided. Only 34%. But there's a real time bomb in that poll which must terrify the Republicans, because that is, of all age groups, it's the 18 to 24 who go significantly lower than the average of 34%. They go down, after all their education, all that Marxist education in the schools of Australia, they go down to 24%. Now, if you can't persuade the young of some radical proposal, like changing the Constitution significantly in this way, for no good purpose, if you can't persuade the young to that, you've lost. And that's what terrifies. It terrifies the Republicans. That's why they've become desperate. They're so desperate that a Labour government has been instructed from the National Conference to have a national minister for the Republic, so that when they're in office, the minister, his advisors, and they all have all of these acolyte politicians who are called advisors, the consultants, vast amounts of taxpayer funds, which seem to be endless in relation to government activities, all devoted to undermining a significant institution in the Constitution. But when you look at the Constitution itself and you go to Section 61, what is the executive government of Australia? The Constitution instructs us that the executive government of Australia extends to the execution and maintenance of the Constitution and the laws of the Commonwealth. Maintenance of the Constitution. Here you have a proposal for the Albanese government to have a minister in the government whose task, with the resources of the federal government, will be to undermine a constitutional institution. I don't think that in any way is acceptable. It means that instead of dedicating himself to the maintenance of the Constitution, this government will be dedicating themselves to the subversion of the Constitution. Before I go on to those myths, and I'll just go through them quickly, there is a correlation, an interesting correlation. I call it the Beijing correlation. Correlations, of course, as we know, prove nothing. There's a famous correlation, which was once found in England. It's between the bank rate of the Bank of England and the incidence of chronic diarrhea in the Highlands. That there was a correlation between that, but it doesn't, of course, prove anything. But there is a correlation. There's a peculiar influence of Beijing. Some very prominent Republicans in the Republican campaign subsequently became involved in organizations under the control of the Beijing government, which were paying them vast amounts of money. We've seen in Barbados the move of Barbados into virtually a Soviet, not a Soviet, a Chinese sphere of influence. So there is a very interesting correlation between Beijing and republicanism in Australia, which proves nothing. I finally, in my paper, have a list of the leading, or it's a mélange of the leading myths and mendacities and misrepresentations, and I'll very quickly refer to them. May I begin by pointing out that during the Republican campaign, it became more and more obvious that the Republicans were unable to explain why we should become a republic, and the reasons became more and more ridiculous. The most ridiculous being Al Grasby's claim that the Crown was responsible for the rate of unemployment in Australia. They then grasped at something, they fell into it, and that is head of state. We've got to have a head of state. That question has been well covered in previous papers, including those by Sir David Smith. I won't deal with it now, but it will be summarised in my paper. The second myth is that a republic was never considered at federation. It was. If you go to the 1891 convention, it's not in the main convention, you have to go to one of the committees. There was a serious proposal to change what is now Section 2 of the Constitution. Section 2 of the Constitution says that there will be, and I'll just get it out. Section 2 says that a Governor-General appointed by the Queen shall be Her Majesty's representative and shall have and may exercise, etc., etc. What they wanted, the change was to be that there shall be a Governor-General, not appointed by the Queen, just to state there is a Governor-General. And the reason was, and they were very open about it, the proponent was Sir George Grey, and what he wanted was to make, at some time in the future, not straight away, but at some time in the future, to make the Governor-General electable. The Governor-General would be elected by the people. With the vast powers of the Governor-General, you would really have a republic in Australia, because he would become, after a political election, exercising all of those powers, he would obviously exercise them as the president does in France. He would be the president of Australia. That was rejected in committee, and later on Sir Samuel Griffith spoke very strongly against the idea of having a single person executive rather than the collective executive we have in our system of responsible government. The third myth that has come out is that John Howard rigged the convention. And you'll see that repeated even in letters today. John Howard rigged the convention. The convention consisted of 76 elected delegates, 40 ex officio, premiers and the like, and ministers, and 36 in the gift of the government. That was for the Prime Minister to decide, no doubt advised by Nick Minchin. And when you check the voting of those delegates, which I did, which you have to do manually, go through the vote, each of the votes in the convention, 10 of the 36 turned out to be monarchists, and 26 turned out to be Republicans. So John Howard appointed 26 of his 36, he appointed 26 Republicans, hardly rigging the convention. The next point was, the fourth point was, John Howard rigged the model. Absolutely ridiculous. The model was chosen by the convention. The model was supported by a majority or the largest number of elected delegates. It cannot be said that John Howard chose the model. And then fifthly, John Howard chose the question. The question was chosen by a committee. I appeared before that committee. Everybody on that committee said they were a Republican. Even Eric Abet said he was a Republican and asked why we didn't support what was called the McGarvey model. Now, that question had to go through the Parliament in the legislation. It was approved by overwhelmingly Republican majorities in both houses. John Howard had nothing to do with the question. The sixth point is that popular election would have won. If they'd had a popular election model, it would have won. If you go through the figures, in relation to the election, and then look at the models, there were 4 models presented to the floor of the convention. Of those 4 models, 2 had popular election, but 1 was a guided democracy model. That was the one favoured by the real Republicans. There'd be 3 candidates chosen by Parliament. It'd be, I suppose, Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull and Bob Brown, and the people would then choose from the 3 politicians that the politicians had chosen. There'd have to be deals in Parliament to get those through. And that was to be a popular election. It wasn't a real popular election model. The only popular election model was the Hayden model. There were only 4 models. The only real popular election model was the Hayden model. You would think that the convention was representative of the Australian people. I think that there was a weighting in relation to republicanism because it was a voluntary vote, a postal vote, on the basis of rolls kept by the Australian Electoral Commission, which contain a number of fraudulent entries. We know that. That's well established. It happens just before every election. And I think it resulted in a weighting towards republicanism. But what was the support of the real popular model if you look at the votes represented by the delegates who supported it? Only 2 delegates elected delegates supported this popular election, and they represented 2.6% of the nation. The idea that popular election somehow is very popular with the Australian people is not supported by the facts. I'll put those figures in my paper. There were other points I wanted to mention, and very quickly. One is the only reason that the Vote No case won was because of the popularity of the Queen. Completely untrue. This was at the time which just resulted from the death of Diana. There was a massive campaign by the London tabloids to attack the Queen and to create some blame on her about the death of Diana. And the 2 things they were attacking the Queen on was the flag over Buckingham Palace, you might remember, and the princes being kept at Balmoral and not brought down to London immediately. But that campaign worked. There was a state of all near hysteria over the death of the princess. Kerry Jones, who was in the office at ACM, told me after that she had the worst day in her time in that office. The number of people who called to say they were tearing up their cars, they were going to vote for a republic. It was finished for them about the money. The Queen was unpopular. And that's shown in the Crown, one of the true things shown in the Crown. The Crown is full of a lot of rubbish, but that was actually true. The Queen became quite unpopular during that period. It was a real dint in her popularity, not for something she had done, but for a really vicious campaign by the London media. And the result was, nobody can say that the election was won because the Queen was popular, which means also that they can't say that at the end of this reign, Australians will wake up and suddenly decide that they want to have a republic. One thing is certain, Australians are not lying awake at night wondering who their head of state is. The next point is that a republic is easily grafted onto the present constitution. They've been trying for years. Professor Patrick Lane at the University of Sydney, in one of his really wonderful books on the constitution many years ago, saw this possibility. He said, what Republicans will have to do is have a new constitution. This is a constitution for a constitutional monarchy. It's based on the conventions for one. You just can't graft a republic onto that. And the 10th point I'd like to make is they think, there is an argument, that the republic will be easily introduced when the older generation, my generation, passes away. Well, that Ipsos poll demonstrates with only 24% of young people, 18 to 24, supporting a republic, there's no guarantee and every indication to the contrary that the young people are suddenly going to want a republic. In conclusion, then, I think the wordings of my friend Sean Jacobs is completely true. This 30-year-old campaign, which has distracted politicians, most of whom are not so good in dealing with their priority areas. Look at defence, for example. And at least now we do have a real Minister for Defence, but the defence of this country, as you might have seen from Sheridan's article, where I do agree with Sheridan, the situation is appalling. And there are so many other instances. The politicians are not paying attention. I think this society has illustrated that the federal politicians are so interested and involved in interfering in affairs which were the intention of which, under the Constitution, was to reserve them to the states. that they're doing things that they're not competent to do in Canberra. Education is a particular example. It is a problem looking for a solution. Thank you.